we've mentioned that if you have a question, that if you'll let me know or put it back in the box, and we'll go over those questions. And the last time I answered a question, the people weren't here that were asking the question. And I think we have some people here and some people not here that asked this question. And if you would, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And this, I believe, is a passage of scriptures that really gets a lot of folks thinking about a lot of different things as far as it comes to head coverings. And so we're going to take a time to study God's word. And I believe this is a cultural issue that's taking place. Now, God says he's not the author of confusion in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. So this statement here, and we're going to read verses 2 through 16 because this is going to be the text of the study today. And I'm going to make comments along the way. And now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covering dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since it is the image of the glory of God, but a woman is the glory of man. For man is not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither is man created from woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have the symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man of woman. For as woman is made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God and have her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Now, there's a lot of things we're going to talk about in here. And we have a lot of cultural issues, and this is going to be a cultural issue they're going to be talking about in their day and time that we're going to relate to today. The practice, we're going to talk about the practice, we're going to talk about the principle. Now, first of all, we can see that when you look at cultural issues, and this would be one, cultural issues today, we talk about what is life. That's a cultural issue that's going on. And so in Exodus, and if you want to look in Exodus 21, we're going to look at some of these issues that are going on, and then we're going to get in and tackle the passage at hand. So Exodus 21. Exodus 21, when you start talking about life, you start talking about what is life, abortion, those types of things. Exodus 21, starting in verse 22, says, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. It talks about life for life. So if the pregnant woman loses her child, that would be an abortion that was not planned. And the person that hit that woman, maybe not intending, has to give up his life for ending such a life. And we talk about, there's the matter of race. Our country loves to bring that issue up, dividing us about race. And in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, he says there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile or Greek, but we're all one in Christ. Talk about, we have a definition of what right and wrong is, and that seems to be changing every day. And Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20 talks about, woe to them who mistake in light for darkness and darkness for light, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. And so there is no confusion, but our society confuses things. Talks about, is there a God? We have more people today believing that there is no God than that there is a God. And so a fool says in his heart, there is no God, as it's spoken in Psalms. And then, to follow the law or not to follow the law. And so in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, because some things we just think, well, they shouldn't be a law, so it's okay to break it. It's okay to go ahead and take as many things as we want because we won't get charged. All those things you see on the news. And so Romans chapter 13, verse 1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Well, that's it right there. We're supposed to obey the laws of the land. People talk about your truth, my truth. There is no truth. But John chapter 17, verse 17 says your word is truth. So there is absolute. There's not relative truth. There's absolute. When it talks about a man and a woman in marriage, that's how it's defined. That's how it's defined in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. That's all throughout the different arguments through the New Testament. It's talking about a man and a woman, as it talks about in 1 Corinthians 7 and Matthew chapter 19. It's a man and a woman. And it's supposed to be a man and a woman for life. We talk about drugs, illegal. Is it illegal? Is it legal? If it's legal now, I can go ahead and pursue it. But it talks about many things being that can lead you astray. In Proverbs chapter 20, it talks about beer is a brawler and wine is a mocker, and whoever's led by them is unwise. It talks about in Proverbs 23, it talks about a person who's addicted to wine. And this is a drug. So you can look at that and you can go all across that just because something's legal doesn't mean it's beneficial. Look at morality. You think about the moral of things and the morality of things. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, it says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Talking about addictions, talking about those things that can master you. It also talks about something that I've mentioned in the past that would be definitely something to make use of if you haven't underlined before. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23, if it doesn't necessarily define it in God's word being right or wrong, we can know it based off a few questions. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23, it says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. So is whatever I'm wondering about, is it helpful for me? If not, I should stay away. Going on that verse that says, all things are lawful, but not all things build up. Is a question I have, is this activity going to be something that builds me up or builds others up? If not, I should stay away. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his own, but the good of his neighbor. So is this going to be something that helps my neighbor out? It's going to be good for him. If not, I should leave it out. As it goes on, it talks about in verse 31, so whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do all to the glory of God. Is what the practice, the thing that I want to do to participate in, is this going to bring glory to God? If not, then I should leave it out. As it goes on in verse 33, but as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own good or my own advantage. So is this something that's all about me? It's going to be selfish for me to participate in? If so, I should do away with it. As it continues in verse 33, but that of many, that they may be saved. So is it going to be to my own good, or is it going to help others be saved? So if it's not going to help people be saved, the practice and the activity I want to do, I should leave it out. And then in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So is this going to help me imitate Christ or not? And if not, I should leave it out. And so we have those things about morality that the world, if they would just look at these scriptures right here, It'd solve a lot of problems and a lot of issues going on. You know, we think that we can do anything that we want. We think that we have no limit to what we can do. Our imagination is limitless, and so therefore we can do whatever. But Philippians chapter 4, verse 13 says, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. He's the one that provides the opportunity. We're the reasons why we have the ability is because of him. And it also mentions in Genesis chapter 5, and then we're going to start in with 1 Corinthians, but Genesis chapter 5, because this goes right into some of the cultural issues that are taking place today, and the reason why we have some issues here with 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Genesis chapter 5, verse 2. It says, male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. Male and female. Two genders. That's what he's talking about. And this church here has problems, all kinds of problems. The church in Corinth is listed and loaded with issues. We have our own problems here too. But if we were to compare, I think that they've outdone us. Because if you looked in chapter 1 through chapter 4, they've got a problem of division. They're divided all over. Some following this person, some following another. They have problems of immorality in chapter 5 of Corinthians. There's even people in chapter 6 that are suing each other. I can't imagine if we started suing each other how this little divide here in between the pews would get wider and wider. I believe I've told you before that there was a group where I worshiped, and they asked me to come speak. And as I'm up there, I realized, because I knew this group and I knew what was going on, and all of a sudden I started looking in the crowd and I could see that they were completely divided where they were sitting based off of what they believed in this issue of, I believe it was the preacher at that time that was there. And I'm just looking and thinking, man, they're completely divided over this. You could see it. They were hostile. They'd look up here toward me, but they wouldn't look to each other. Well, can you imagine if we started suing each other? It'd be the same type of thing. There'd be a lot of hostility, a lot of anger towards each other. We wouldn't be able to worship because we'd be thinking about our neighbor. Well, they had issues in chapter 6 with immorality as far as fornication and not being pure. They had issues about marriage. They thought, you know, some people were better than others based off marriage. They had problems with meat being sacrificed. Should you eat it? Should you not? They had all kinds of issues as it pertains to that. In chapter 11, something that we read here often, starting in verse 17, they had problems about taking the Lord's Supper. I mean, some would just gobble it up and not leave any for anyone else to partake when we're commanded to take that each Sunday. There was an issue about ability versus love. They had miraculous things. Man, I could do all these things. Well, I want those gifts. Well, you can't have them. They're all mine. And it was a back and forth. And it was solved by saying the greatest thing is love. And that's what you ought to pursue. Everybody can. But the Spirit gives as He's determined. They had issues about resurrection. Has a resurrection, will you and I really be resurrected? And so there was a whole thing, well, if Christ hasn't been resurrected, we should be most pitied. You know, because He overcame death, allowing us to overcome death. There was lots of issues. And so I want to go back to chapter 11 if you're there. Chapter 11, the very beginning, they have an issue about staying in their lane. You ever been driving down the highway and someone doesn't stay in their lane? It's very frustrating. I mean, they kind of start encroaching on you. I was driving this yesterday with the other fellows in the car, and I get a call because from the person in front. I didn't know who that person in front was, but I knew who was calling me, and I answered, and they said, you better tell the driver, and I won't give the name since I'm recording it, you better tell the driver to get off me. You know, I'm going to slam my brakes. And I said, hey, your old secretary wants you to back off. You know, and so we had no idea. Well, he real close. And, you know, and the whole time you have people kind of coming in and out of the lane and just kind of going halfway. There was every day when I'm driving, you know, home or to work, there's someone that's just getting over off their lane and someone just kind of hanging out in the middle sometimes. Not staying in your lane. That's a big deal. because it makes it everyone else kind of wondering, okay, what are the rules here? Well, that's what's going on here. It's staying in your lane. That's what's happening. A lot of people wonder, is this passage here talking about worship or is it non-worship? And I believe it's talking about non-worship, because it talks about when women prophesy and pray. And we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 14 that it talks about how women remain silent when they're in the corporate worship. And so it's basically not defining as one inferior to another, but it's talking about everybody has their role. Everybody has the role that they're supposed to play. If I was to ask Kelly, it'd be pretty easy to say if everybody was a quarterback, wouldn't that be fun to play football if everybody's a quarterback? There's only one ball, right? Not everybody can have it. Not everybody can hand it off or throw it. If everybody was a center, well, they wouldn't be giving it to anybody. They'd just be holding it the whole time because no one's there to receive the ball. So if you just had one role the whole time, it'd be difficult. But everyone in the game of football, everybody has their role. Just like in any sport, everybody has their role. I was watching basketball this weekend, and you can tell when one person out of those 5 are not following and not maintaining their role. The offense breaks down or the defense breaks down. Something breaks down, whichever side of the ball that you're on, because you're not following your role. That's what's taking place. Some people want to know if this is a cultural or a historic principle. And I believe this is a cultural issue that's going on. I'll explain why. Some people want to know if it's just for this time period, or is this something that's ongoing that we should be doing? We should be following this practice right here. Well, I think it's the principle that endures, not the practice. I think the practice is obsolete, and I'm going to try to explain why I believe that is the case. And here he's talking about several things. He has that there's 2 genders here. The reason why I mentioned that at the very beginning, there's 2 genders mentioned in 1 Corinthians 11. There's not, going back and forth saying, I want to be a man today, I want to be a woman today, so I can switch my role. No, I've got to stay in the lane that I've been assigned by God. Like it or not, that's my role. So there's 2 genders, but what we miss out in our society is that they complement each other. And it's really great how it kind of works together. Because initially, woman came from man. And now all men come from women. It's needed all over. And so this, I believe, is talking about submission. The whole aspect of chapter 11, 2 through 16 is talking about submission. It's something that nobody wants. Nobody here wants submission because we want to do it our way, when we want, how we want, for as long as we want. You have kids, you're trying to raise them up and you want them to do certain things. They don't want to submit, but you have to give consequences so they will submit and they'll learn. When at work, there's certain things that are in your lane that you're supposed to do and certain things you're not supposed to do. And when you get out of your lane, it's because you're not submitting to those that are above you. And the same is true in this right here. The reason I believe that these head coverings are something cultural is because in 2 Samuel chapter 15, it talks about, in verse 30 and following, it talks about how David prayed with his head covered. So it's not something that he was dishonoring God during this time when he was living. It also talks about the Nazarites. The Nazarite vow was for men not to cut their hair. So it's not talking about that, is where it talks about, hey, doesn't the very nature of things talk about a woman should have long hair and a man should have short hair? So it's not talking about that either. So it's about, and it also talks about how high priests wore a turban on their head there in Leviticus 16 verse 4. So you have all these different things where you have men wearing, some type of a headgear, and you have the example of men having long hair that had the Nazarite vow. So that's not it. And so back in this day and time in the first century, there would be no Jew nor Gentile that would have gotten confused what a head covering was. They knew that was something that that was part of their normal attire anytime. That was something they did anytime they left the house. That was their normal attire. So the problem is is women dismissing the token or the symbol of womanhood and denying the place of being in subjection to men. It's not staying in your lane. That's what this is. And so here, let's talk about a few things. In verse 2, it says, "Now I commend you to remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you." Now, traditions is not talking about traditions of men. We know that's condemned. Jesus many times says traditions of men you should be following, but these traditions would be the things that have been passed down by the apostles. Things that would have been things written down that we have that we're reading today. So those would have been those traditions. In verse 3, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." Now man, it's talking about that everybody has a lane to stay in. And a lot of men don't like the lane that they're in. And so they want women to be in authority so they can sit back and do nothing. You know, there's a lot of men out there that just sit back and do nothing when it comes just to the corporate worship, or when it comes to anything in the home, anything in life. Man, nah, I just want to be left alone. I just want to do what I want to do. That's not the lane they're supposed to be in. And so, looking at this, I've seen a lot of women making a lot of, judgment calls or decisions because the man is totally void and silent on anything that comes up because he's not taking his role. But it says man is subject here in verse 3 to Christ. He needs to remember his place. And woman is in submission to man. And then it also says Christ is a submission to God. So you have God the Father, God the Son, man and woman. Now, both of them, man and woman, are submissive to Christ. Both man and woman are submissive to God. Both man and woman, it talks about in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, should be submissive to one another. So this is a different type of relationship. This is within the home. And so looking at it as it goes on, as it talks about verse 3, the authority, God's order of authority, verse 4. "Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head." Now, he's saying back in this time, it would be strange and very bizarre for a man to have his head covered while he's praying. They wouldn't have done that. Very similar to today's time when women can come in here and wear a hat, and it's, it could be big. Guy ain't going to say a thing at all, right? Because it's something that it would be part of the style. But a guy comes in and it's considered dishonorable. It's not an honorable thing. When you have the national anthem, they go through the national anthem and they say, okay, now, and they roll out the national anthem. They always say, "And men, please remove your hats." They don't say that to the woman, but they say that to the man, because in today's culture, for a man not to remove his hat would be dishonorable. It's the culture of things. And so he was saying, just like it would be strange for a man not to cover his head, it would be strange because, if a woman rejects her femaleness, if that is a word, because there's a maleness and there's a femaleness, a man being a man and a woman being a woman. He's talking about the roles that we're supposed to be playing. And so men aren't supposed to be looking like women, and women aren't supposed to be looking like men. And so as we get on, we'll see some things I think that make more sense. And it says in verse 5, "But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven." Now, during this time, women wouldn't leave the house without having a veil, a head covering. I'm not talking about a doily that you've seen some people that read this passage and think, man, I'm worried. And so they have this symbol. It's just a little doily that you put down in a coffee, deal. You put that right there. And they had, it was a head covering. It wasn't just something they just plop up there. It showed her husband that I'm respecting you. Now, it would be disgraceful to do otherwise. And it would be just as bad as her shaving her head. And And during this time, a woman that shaves her head would be a person that would have either been a person that was caught as an adulterous woman, and she'd have to shave her head, and I believe it was for 2 years, you have to keep her head shaved. Or it was a prostitute. And so if you have your head uncovered, he's saying, just the very nature says, you might as well, it's so strange, you might as well just go ahead and shave it. It's the same thing. So some would say this is not meant for public worship because he's not talking about the speaking in the public assembly, as we mentioned. As it talks about in 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, he addresses the women's role in the corporate worship. Now, verse 6, for if a wife will not have her head, not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or to shave her head, let her cover her head. In other words, it's shameful not to live within your role or to stay in your lane. It's shameful for a man, it's shameful for a woman. The reason why it's here, it seems as though that was an issue in that day and time in the church of Corinth. There's 2 ways that man can reject God's place. If he wears female clothes or if he has a hairstyle like a woman. And there's 2 ways that woman can reject God's place. If she dresses like a man or she has hair like a man. He's saying you need to enjoy the role that you're in. Now, we have some women that do have their hair cut short. Now, the difference is if you know that's a woman, you know that's a woman. And if that hair is so long, you think it's a woman and it's a man, something's wrong. If the hair is so short, you think it's a man and it's a woman, then something wrong. It's the nature of things we're going to get into. So it's a disgrace. Disgrace is due to women associated with being a prostitute or adultery. That would be a sign of rebellion, is what it's talking about there in verse 6. So the problem is women that were wishing to ignore their place in their role. They're wanting to take the lead, assert the man. And so this does not in any way talk about, I mentioned a friend of mine, every time he talks about and preaches Ephesians chapter 5, he hammers that wives submit to their husbands, and he forgets that in the following verses it talks about the man should love the wife like Christ loved the church. That's sacrificial love. The reason why I'm hitting so hard on the submission today is because that's what this question is about. What are we supposed to have head coverings today? Because I see it there. And I want to make sure that I am honestly doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. So verse 7. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Verse 8. For man is not made from woman, but woman from man. See, man is the glory of God, and woman is the glory of man, it's talking about. In verse 9, neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So it's starting to give you the reasoning behind it. It's a matter of submission. It talks about in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, that the female is made to be a helper or a helpmeet to the male, and that woman was created for man. The word woman means it is me. And so the amazing thing is Adam sees Eve, calls her woman, meaning it is me. It's taken from me. It's taken from my rib. And it's amazing how that marriage, the two shall become one. And so they have different roles, but they're still together and become one. Now, verse 10, this is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. A lot of people not sure exactly what this verse means, but it seems like it could give indication to Jude verse 6, where it talks about the angels rebelled and didn't keep their position. They didn't keep their place. So angels are supposed to submit too. So now looking at this, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Because the angels lost their position when they didn't stay in their lane, when they chose to rebel. And so the same would be true for a man or a woman. When we choose to rebel, then we're not in good company. Verse 11, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man of woman. So man and woman are dependent upon each other. As we talked about, those two shall become one. In verse 12, for as a woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. We talked about that earlier, how all women, they came, beginning, Adam, the woman came from Adam, Eve, and now all men come from women. And it says, all things are from God. So a male and a female are dependent on each other and the role that they play. And the amazing thing is, it's God's doing. A man doesn't have to apologize for the role he's in, and a woman doesn't have to apologize for the role she's in. It's been assigned by God. You know, I remember being on different teams where you had certain aspects. I remember coaching, you had certain people, you know, like on a mile relay team, you had certain people assigned to the first, second, third, and fourth leg. You assigned them. And so there might be some bickering along the way about, man, I want to be the anchor leg or different things, but the coach assigned you. So you run in the lane that you're supposed to run in with the leg you're supposed to run in. And so here, the same thing is true. God has designed it. We don't have anything to do with it. We just need to stay in the lane and follow the place, the position we've been given. So then he says in verse 13, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? And then look down in verse 15. But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair has been given for her as a covering. So he says, judge for yourself. Use common sense there in verse 13. The issue there is submission, and still a struggle today. This applies to us today because there's still a problem with submission. There's a problem with submission just in our whole society. Nobody wants to submit to authority. In the very last days, it talks about in the last days, they will not respect authority. And so that's going right along with what was a problem there. So going to verse 4, go back up one verse to verse 14. Does not the nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman wears long hair, it's her glory? Now, nature itself speaks. This basically says the common knowledge of the day. A rock is a rock. If I see a rock, you're going to be able to say it's a rock too. If I see a dog, you're going to be able to say it's a dog. If I see a cat, you're going to be able to say it's a cat. And if I see a sheep, you ought to say, man, it's a sheep. And if it's a male, you ought to be able to say it's a male instead of scratch your head and wonder, is that really a man or not? And if it's a woman, you ought to be able to say it's a woman. You ought not scratch your head and say, I just can't tell. That's where they're talking about as far as the very nature of things. Nature is the observable makeup of reality. Nature means the opposite of what's shameful. Females don't forsake their femaleness. You know, they wear the veil. They act like a woman. Males don't forsake their maleness. They act like a man. It talks about acting like a man in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. It even says, act like a man. It's more than hair. It's a woman shouldn't be mistaken for a male. And vice versa. Males shouldn't be mistaken for a woman. You know, there's no way men that follow the Nazirite vow there in Numbers chapter 6 or in Judges where it talks about Samson, verse 13, there's no way anybody thought Samson was a woman. So it's not the fact that it's a must have long hair, but it does go back in the 80s when men started dressing like women, putting on makeup. You know, some of the performers, they put on makeup, they do different things. I remember this one particular person, and I thought, I don't know if it's a man or a woman. And then all of a sudden, I heard this person sing. I was like, oh, that's a man then. You know, but I couldn't tell just right off. I mean, my cousin dressed just like this person, had no idea. So that's not what it's talking about. There's no way society back then would have mistaken a person that had a Nazirite vow for being a woman. So in other words, how does this strike you if men walk around looking like women? That's the aspect of what's going on. And so the nature or the general thought of things is that men have short hair and women have long hair. Men don't look like women and women don't look like men. So the general rule is if a man has hair that looks like a woman, it's too long. And if a woman has hair that looks like a man, it's too short. So there's a whole lot in between. Even the Spartans, they'd have hair down to their shoulder. Now, no way in time of history of mankind would anybody mistake a Spartan man for being a woman. But the principle is Christ submits to God, man submits to Christ, and the woman submits to man. The issue here is talking about rebellion. Women should not be immodest and have improper displays of independence, since that's not the position that God has set. A woman wearing a hat in Western culture, in our Western society, has never been a sign of submission. It's always been a sign of fashion. And you go to some of the congregations I've been in, you know it's not submission, it is fashion. Because there's all kinds of hats and designs you've never seen before. Paul's not talking about the veil. He is talking about a veil, a head covering. He's not talking about a hat. He's not talking about a handkerchief. He's not talking about a doily. The veil is no longer a sign of authority or submission, as was the reason why in verse 10 that she was supposed to wear it. But that's not a sign here in our culture. The veil is no longer an expression of propriety and decency, as it talks about in verse 5. You might as well shave it because it's disgraceful. That's not what it is today. A veil in our culture is no longer a sign of honor or dishonor for the woman's head, as it talks about in verse 5 being dishonorable. And so in the first century, it was shameful for a woman not to wear a veil. In the first century, it was shameful for a woman to shave her head. So there's a reason why she had a head covering. Today, it's not shameful for a woman to wear a veil. It's not a stigma that it used to be if you didn't have a veil. There's no custom where a woman, not wearing a head covering means, because that wasn't just during the worship. That was anytime they went out, they did these things. And in certain parts of the Middle East, that still, you have the veil, the head covering, that is still part of dishonorable or honorable. And so if a person was going to go to that culture today, the women would need to wear a head covering, because you would be, as the aspect when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When I was in Africa, I was told all the different customs, not all of them, but some of the different customs that they had. Some of them you just don't do because you don't want to dishonor and bring shame to yourself or other people, because you're there in the name of Christ. So I remember they said, if a man comes up and holds your hand, you go ahead and accept it. And I'm talking fingers locking together. You go ahead and do that. Because here, that's considered a sign of homosexuality. But there, it's a sign of friendship. So I was there in Africa, and I see two guys do that, and I'm like, that's true. Because they were the best of buds. They're just holding each other's hands. It's kind of like today, we give a guy a handshake, and we give him a hug, we give him that, the man hug, the embrace. Or if a guy comes up and puts his hand on the shoulder of somebody, it'd be the same thing for them interlocking hands walking down the street. But in their society, a man and a woman did not kiss, did not show affection, did not hold hands, didn't do anything, because that was improper. That would be shameful. Same was true in this country of Africa, that if a woman was going to go out in public, very similar to this head covering, a woman was going to go out in public, that she is supposed to wear a skirt or a dress. She cannot wear pants, because that would be shameful and dishonorable. And that would be her saying her authority is more important than her husband's. So that would be today's idea of a head covering today in their society. And so you'd see anybody that was American came, they'd have skirts and dresses because they don't want to bring any shame or disrespect to Christ. And so the principle, while those things still take place, the principle is true. It's all about submission, staying within the lane that God has given you. And it says in verse 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. The principle is that this should be in all churches there. And that was a practice that they would continue wearing that because the nature of things, the cultural thought was to continue doing this because that would be respected. Anything opposite would be a counter to the submission that God wants us to have. So looking at this, I'm hoping that it helps because Christians aren't supposed to be the trendsetters. We're supposed to be the people that follow in submission to the authority of God, no matter what he says. And so as you look here, hopefully you get a chance to reread this and see if some of this makes sense, or if you have any questions, this will be more than happy to answer. But for us, for today, if you have any need, any desire to ask for the prayers of the church, any desire to become a Christian, please let us know while we